Welcome. My name is Alnoor Bhimani. I'm pleased as director of the South Asia Center at LSE to welcome you all, and particularly the audience watching on Facebook. It's a delight to be hosting this event as part of the Mujib 100, the birth centenary celebrations of the founding father of Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. The South Asia Center has been working consistently since its establishment in 2015 to forefront Bangladesh in South Asia. And we've had the privilege of hosting High Commissioner Tasneem, her predecessor, High Commissioner Quanain, as well as the former Foreign Secretary, Shahidul Haq. The center hosts the Charles Wallace Bangladesh Trust Postdoctoral Fellowship every year. This year, you'll be pleased to know we've received a record number of applications. Sadly, because of the pandemic, we're postponing that until next year. We're the only South Asia center in Europe to have established an academic relationship with the Subir and Malini Chowdhury Center for Bangladesh Studies at UC Berkeley. We hosted our first joint conference here at the LSE in 2018, and the second one in Berkeley in 2019, and we're determined, the pandemic permitting, that we'll host one next year or perhaps in early 2022 in Dhaka. Our conferences have had frank and critical discussions on topics of contemporary relevance, such as the rights of minorities, public health, social entrepreneurship, women's empowerment, popular culture as a form of sovereignty, civil society, state relations, among others of interest. We have working papers on all of these panel discussions with experts available at our center's websites. Against this background, we're really delighted to host specially curated events to mark 2020-2021 as a unique period because it marks the birth centenary of Bangabandhu and thus followed by the Golden Jubilee of Bangladesh's independence in 21-22. The center has released a special logo to mark the Golden Jubilee. Please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and do join our mailing list on our website so you can keep informed. We have specially commissioned blog posts, online digital exhibitions, specially curated panel discussions, seminars, workshops, and the first of which is going to take place on 8 February, where we have 6 international authors looking at the birth of Bangladesh in 1971. So do join us then. I'd like to thank especially High Commissioner Tasneem, who's been very, very forthcoming and supportive right from the start when the center contacted the High Commission about this event, and her personal interest and open-mindedness about this event and how we could curate this is really sort of very much appreciated. We're delighted to do this event in collaboration with the High Commission. It's time now to move to today's proceedings. So I'd like to introduce Baroness Minouche Shafik. She is, as you know, the director of the LSE. She's an alumni of the LSE, an economist by training. Minouche's career has straddled public policy and academia. Immediately prior to her joining the LSE as director in 2017, Minouche was deputy director of the Bank of England. In recognition for her services, Minouche was made a Dame by Her Majesty the Queen in her New Year's Honours list in 2015, and she's also been included in the University of London's Leading Women campaign. More recently, in 2020, the UK government announced that Minouche would be made a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. So it's my pleasure to pass over to Minouche to introduce the speakers for today's event. And thank you all to you for listening. Thank you.
I am delighted to be here today to host this event, albeit virtually, but because it's virtual, we've been able to unite people from around the world, from Dhaka to the United States for this very special occasion. Now, the London School of Economics has a long historical relationship with South Asia, and the activities of the South Asia Center have made sure that we don't just have a glorious past, but we also have a glorious future in the region. And this is especially true in the case of Bangladesh, where we're proud to say we have the largest number of faculty in the UK specialized in Bangladesh, and that's across a wide array of disciplines, ranging from social policy to gender, to anthropology, geography, and climate change. And we also have many PhD candidates who are focused on Bangladesh. We also have a very vibrant LSE SU Student Union Bangla Society, which is thriving and an active and vibrant alumni association in Dhaka, who are famous for the hospitality that they offer to anyone who visits from the LSE. And because of all of that, I'm delighted to welcome Her Excellency Saida Tasneem, the High Commissioner of the People's Republic of Bangladesh in the UK. And she's also Bangladesh's permanent representative to the International Maritime Organization. She's a chemical engineer by training, and she also has a master's degree in public policy and management from the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. And we are delighted to turn to her for her remarks today. Over to you, Your Excellency. And you're still on mute.
Thank you, Baroness Minouche and Professor Bhimani. I'm humbled by your introduction. In April 2004, a BBC listener survey in search of the greatest Bengali of all time ranked him as the greatest Bengali of all time out of 20 greatest Bengalis voted upon, including 2 Bengali Nobel laureates, Kavi Guru Rabindranath Tagore and father of welfare economics and social choice theory, the living Bengali legend present here today, the very distinguished Professor Amartya. The reason our greatest Bengali topped the BBC list was that he was the only Bengali who would envision, struggle, and eventually succeed in creating an independent country for the Bengali people, Bangladesh, that literally means land of the Bengalis, and would not only shake the Ratcliffe line, but also disrupt the geopolitical status quo of a post-colonial South Asia. And this greatest Bengali visionary is none other than the Bangladesh's founding father, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. No, it was not any political government that randomly decided to brand him as the greatest Bengali of all time. It was the BBC's global listeners, Bengali and non-Bengali alike, who crowned him the Bangabandhu, the people's title of choice. In a post-1947 East Pakistan, when the freedom-loving Bengali people were subjugated to systematic oppression, discrimination, bigotry, and new colonization under an Islamic republic and a military state, it would be Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujib who would emerge as the undisputed leader of a secular Bengali nationalist movement. Over the next 23 years, Bangabandhu would fearlessly lead the Bengali people in our every political, economic, cultural rights struggle, from the Bengali language movement of 1952 to our epic War of Liberation in 1971. In 1969, at a mammoth public gathering of millions of Bengalis at the Dhaka racecourse, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, following his acquittal from the infamous Agartala conspiracy case of plotting with India, the secession of East Pakistan, was awarded the title, the Bangabandhu, meaning the friend of Bengal. And again, it was no government of Bangladesh that had arbitrarily awarded our founding father this unique title. It was a spontaneous people's title given to the Bangabandhu as a symbol of the love and trust he earned from his beloved Bengali nation, much before East Pakistan became Bangladesh. A man of peace and non-violence and a Gandhian at heart, the Bangabandhu, while a student of Islamia College at Calcutta University, volunteered to protect both Hindus and Muslims alike during the Great Kolkata killings and joined the 1947 peace mission of the Mahatma Gandhi. Between 1947 and 1971, the Bangabandhu was arrested 22 times and spent nearly 13 years of his political life in prison in peaceful protests and hunger strikes. The Newsweek magazine in its April 1971 issue dubbed the Bangabandhu as the poet of politics, hailing his historic 7 March speech, one speech that mobilized 750 million Bengalis for Bangladesh's independence, a speech that the UNESCO in 2017 preserved in the memory of the World Register as it changed the course of history. In August 1971, when Bangabandhu's summary military trials, while imprisoned in Pakistan, surfaced in international media, the Time magazine UK paid him a tribute, and I quote, "A man of vitality and vehemence, Mujib became the political Gandhi of the Bengalis, symbolizing their hopes and voicing their grievances. Not even Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, drew the million-strong throngs that Mujib had attracted in Dhaka. Nor for that matter has any subcontinent politician since Gandhi's days spent so much time behind bars for his political beliefs. As the government of Bangladesh and the UNESCO jointly commemorate in 2020 and 2021 the birth centenary of the friend of Bengal, I pay my deepest homage to this indomitable leader of Bengali civil rights movement and architect of Bangladesh's independence, the immortal Bangabandhu." The Bangladesh High Commission London is honored to be organizing its first ever Bangabandhu Centenary talk in collaboration with the very vibrant South Asia Center of the very illustrious London School of Economics that celebrates its own 125th anniversary and has to its credit 27% of all Nobel Prize winning economists of the world, including our Bengali pride, Professor Amartya Sen. Today, the people of Bangladesh and I reaffirm our heartfelt gratitude and unbounded happiness to another greatest Bengali, Professor Amartya Sen, for commemorating the Bangabandhu with his talk, Bangabandhu and Visions of Bangladesh. Professor Sen, with his Bengali ancestry rooted to Bangladesh, is as much an argumentative Indian as he is an argumentative Bengali free spirit. In many ways, perhaps he vindicates in his developmentist freedom and social choice theory, Bangabandhu's uncompromising faith in people's freedom, reaffirmed in his 1974 UN General Assembly speech, and I quote, "Mr. President, I conclude by reaffirming my faith in the indomitable spirit of man, in the capacity of the people to achieve the impossible and to overcome insurmountable odds." Professor Amartya joined the LSE faculty in 1971, and today, in 2021, I pay a special tribute to him on his 50 years since teaching at the LSE when he delivers the seminal Bangabandhu Centenary talk. I'm also delighted that Professor Rehman Sobhan, Bangladesh's most eminent economist, a Bengali nationalist himself, a valiant freedom fighter, and a leading member of Bangabandhu's Post-Independence Planning Commission, joins us today from Dhaka as a discussant. I'm deeply indebted to Baroness Minouche Shafik, Director of the LSE, for chairing today's talk, and to Professor Alnoor Bhimani, Director of LSE South Asia Center, and Deputy Director Nilanjan Sarkar, for their outstanding Fabian commitment to remember and tribute the Bangabandhu, a social democrat at heart, on his auspicious birth centenary. I conclude by celebrating Professor Sen's chosen theme for today's talk. Indeed, Bangabandhu believed in several visions for Bangladesh and his Bengali people. He envisioned a secular People's Republic of Bangladesh, and despite being a devout Muslim, he rejected an Islamic Republic of Bangladesh. He championed democracy, secularism, Bengali nationalism, and social justice as the four pillars of his 1972 constitution. His foreign policy vision of bandhutva, or friendship to all and malice towards none, is a reaffirmation of the Gandhian ahimsa. His ultimate vision for Golden Bengal, a Sonar Bangla, is in fact an economic prosperity vision based on inclusiveness and equal opportunity for all, a legacy being carried forward by his missionary daughter, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, in achieving unprecedented social and economic successes for today's Bangladesh, praised even by the argumentative Indian, Professor Amartya Sen. To understand Bangabandhu, I must conclude by one of Bangabandhu's 1970 quote, reflecting his political philosophy. "As a man, what concerns mankind concerns me. As a Bengali, I'm deeply involved in all that concerns the Bengalis. This abiding involvement is born of and nourished by love, enduring love, which gives meaning to my politics and my very being." I thank you. We look forward to the talk.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those wonderful opening remarks. And now let me turn to our first speaker, who really does not need any introduction, but I'll give a brief one anyway. Professor Amartya Sen, who is Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University and is a Nobel laureate in economics as well. Amartya has a very long association with the London School of Economics, having been a faculty member here, and maintained his links. In fact, I recall him telling me once that his wife often joked that whenever Amartya has to go from A to B, he does it via the LSE. And because of that long-standing commitment and his enormous intellectual contribution, we've created a chair in his honor at the LSE with a special focus on inequality, the Amartya Sen Chair in Inequality. I think we just want to hear from Amartya, so I will cut to the chase and turn the conversation over to him. He will speak to us today about the unique aspects of Sheikh Mujib's cultural nationalist ideology that led to the creation of Bangladesh. Amartya, over to you.
Thank you very much. In plain Bengali, Bangabandhu means friend of Bengal. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was, of course, incomparably more than that. He was a great political leader of Bangladesh, the founder of the idea of an independent Bangladesh, the biggest influence on the lives of Bangladeshis, the most admired person in Bengal, And as has been noted again and again, he can be rightly seen as, quote unquote, the father of the Bangladeshi nation. Being a friend of Bangladesh, or Bangabandhu, is really a very modest way of describing Mujibur Rahman. The fact that he did not ask for a more grand designation and was happy with friendship tells us something really important about him. He did not seek nominal glory. People admired him instinctively. I'm delighted that LSE has arranged this occasion and that I thank the wonderful director of LSE for that leadership. And I'm very grateful on behalf of all Bengalis anywhere that the High Commissioner of Bangladesh is here to give force to what we are going to do in celebration. I'm thrilled to have been given the opportunity of remembering him during the celebrations of the centenary of his birth. Other than paying tribute to this wonderful human being and the great leader that he was, I want to say a few words on why his ideas remain so very important today, in today's world. Bangabandhu has been taken from us, but no one can rob us of his clear-headed visions, which I will argue can make a real difference to the lives we can lead. The subcontinent, India included, is going through, I believe, a challenging period of ideological confusion right now. And we have reason to turn to Bangabandhu for guidance as well as inspiration. Among the many distinct ways in which Sheikh Mujib's thoughts and analysis have powerful relevance today, let me choose a short list of a few. First, Sheikh Mujib was one of the clearest exponents of secularism from which all countries can learn. This included India, the largest country in the subcontinent, which has right now a particular need, I believe, to learn from Bangabandhu's insights. However, looking more broadly, all the countries in the subcontinent need Bangabandhu's ideas. Bangladesh itself has gone through ups and downs on secularism in its history, but since Bangabandhu spoke very clearly on what kind of a Bangladesh he wanted, we can easily read from his exposition what form he would have liked to have given to secularism. I'd like to emphasize here that the association between secularism and human freedom had an inspirational role for Sheikh Mujib. There is one way of looking at secularism, which is often used in Europe very commonly, that includes a general hostility to religion and which sees a secular state as one which never encourages or helps any kind of religious activity. The United States has tried this kind of secularism intermittently, but God and Christianity are so strong in most American minds that secularism in this form is a bit of a non-starter in the USA. The French do it better, a better job of secularism in the sense of shunning religious practice of any kind. But even that is far from pure as far as religion avoiding secularism goes. In Bangabandhu's clear-headed exposition, secularism did not mean that people should not have religious freedom or value it, which is an important kind of freedom that people with religious convictions would surely tend to value. For these reasons, Mujib did not see any great merit in this anti-religious way of thinking of secularism, nor did he find any particular point in avoiding religious practice and sacrificing religious freedom to, quote unquote, become secular. In November 1972, in Dhaka, when the constitution of a new secular democracy was being adopted in the Bangladeshi parliament, Mujib spoke on what he was really seeking in his search for the important value of secularism. I quote from him, actually, from the draft constitution: "We will not stop practice of religion. Muslims will practice their religion, Hindus will practice their religion, Buddhists will practice their religion, Christians will practice their religion. We will only object to the political use of religion," unquote. Religious freedom is held high in this view, and what is negated is the political use and indeed political exploitation of religion. It's a freedom-centered view, as we can notice immediately, and what the state is being asked to do is not interfere in people's practice of their respective religions. Indeed, we should go further and help people to enjoy the freedom of practice of the religion of their choice, if they do have a choice of a religion, and do what we can to stop the interference of others in someone else's religious practice. The state can be useful there in preventing interventions by others. I'm sad to have to say that these principles have taken quite a bit of beating in India recently. Several states within India have prohibited one kind of religious practice or another, including the consumption of particular types of food. For example, beef by members of one community, for example, Muslims, because of the disapproval of another religious community, for example, particularly ritualistic Hindus. Similarly, interreligious marriage have been put under restriction and sometimes even prohibition, despite there being no prohibition of such weddings under the religions chosen by the couples who desire to marry. Also, stories of forcible religious conversion of the bride are often aired, particularly in newspapers. But as court cases have tended to show again and again, these accusations are often very hard to sustain with evidence. The subject of secularism was clearly discussed also long before our time and even before Bangabandhu by the Mughal Emperor Akbar towards the end of the 16th century. As he concluded, there should not be any ban on religious practice freely chosen by people. The state could help in preserving this freedom, but no religion should enjoy privileges not shared by any other religion. The two principles of secularism that I have just discussed, respectively, one, in the form of an asymmetry, the avoidance of an asymmetry, which was emphasized by Akbar, and two, in the form of no political use of religion, on which Bangabandhu focused. They are not, of course, exactly the same, and we can discuss how they relate to each other. But their violation goes against, the violation of either goes against people's religious freedom in similar ways, since the political use of religion tends typically to favor one religion over another. This can be easily illustrated with recent violations of secularism in India, involving political use of religion in ways that favor one religion over another. The understanding of secularism, as explained by Sheikh Mujib and by Akbar, is particularly important right now in many countries in the world. This applies not only to India, but also in other countries across the globe. They are sometimes relevant to political discussions also in the United States and Europe, often not directly in the form of religion, but categories that relate to discrimination in related fields, such as race and ethnic asymmetry. In the subcontinent, they have often touched on issues that contemporary debates and agitation in Pakistan and in Sri Lanka have sharply brought up. The Indian situation is rather more precarious in the historical perspective, since India was much closer to a practicing secular democracy for many decades until relatively recently. The issue has sharply arisen in the context of the impending elections in some state assemblies in India, including West Bengal, for elections due to be held in April or May this year. The central issue of secularism, particularly in the form in which Bangabandhu has explained the basic requirements, demand discussion right now, since the records of different political parties in conforming to and violating the principles of secularism are strongly involved in some of the major electoral battles, including West Bengal, by the way. Bangabandhu's powerful diagnostic criterion about not making political use of religion has extensive applications today. Since it is important in the world, not just for Bengal, Bangabandhu, rightly described as friend of Bengal, can also be described as Vishwabandhu, as friend of the world, because there are gains to be made by people across the world, not just in Bengal, from following and learning from his ideas. Not only did Sheikh Mujib see secularism in the light of freedom, his general interest in the importance of freedom was very strong and steady. Indeed, the central concern about the use of mother tongue in the fight for which Bangabandhu provided leadership related to freedom, and so that the conception of a Bengali nation linked closely with the freedom to use people's own language. This too has been a central question in many subcontinental discussions, including the respective importance given to Sinhalese and to Tamil in Sri Lanka. It is possible that Sri Lanka could have escaped a war and much bloodshed had the political leadership of the country paid more attention to Sheikh Mujib's analysis of the language issue and understood the need for making room for people's own mother language. The wisdom of Bangabandhu's social analysis of language use had applications far beyond Bengal. By giving the status of national language to all the major languages in India, as happened quite early in the history of the Indian polity, some serious problems were surely avoided quite early in India. There was wisdom there, but this constitutional decision was taken in India bearing in mind a rather limited role of the national language, of the national languages, of which there are a great many. But some of Sheikh Mujib's concerns still apply when we turn to the category of official language. While the status of being a national language gives each major language of India an important standing, there are asymmetries, some of which may be inescapable, between the official language in the form of Hindi and English and the other major Indian languages. There are contrasts of privileges between those whose mother tongue happens to be Hindi, and in some cases English, on one side, and other Indians without that convenience. The problem of equity about official use of some language rather than another has to be dealt with pragmatically, but the possible inequality may deserve more attention than it tends to get. This may be to some extent an issue in West Bengal as well, though West Bengal itself is a multilingual state. There are several languages spoken here. My friend Rehman Sobhan present here is always writing on the multitude of languages spoken in Calcutta. But it is a much bigger concern in the southern states, with languages originating mainly from Old Tamil rather than Sanskrit. At the risk of slight oversimplification, it can be said that Sheikh Mujib's priority was always on freedom and the distinct issues, all of them, of status, standing, official use, and use as medium of instruction, have each of them to be judged in that broad light of the importance of freedom. Before ending my presentation, I would like to say a few words on Bangabandhu's concern about advancing equity. In seeking independence from undivided Pakistan, the egalitarian concerns played a significant role in the thinking of the Army League led by Sheikh Mujib. In the campaign speeches for the crucially important 1970 general election, Bangabandhu did not hesitate to place the issue of equity between different religious communities in front of the heterogeneous and at that moment unpredictable voting public. On grounds of the need for equity between, say, Muslims and Hindus, he insisted on the principle that, I quote, the people of the minority community are entitled to enjoy equal rights and opportunities like any other citizen, unquote. Despite the massive majority of Muslims in East Pakistan, the egalitarian sentiment seeking justice for the minority community did not interfere with Army League's spectacular success because of Bangabandhu's persuasive advocacy. In fact, the Army League got 167 out of 169 seats allocated to East Pakistan in the National Assembly in this election of 1970. The effectiveness of cogent reasoning for a just cause is well illustrated by many episodes in Sheikh Mujib's life and politics. And there is a big lesson there too. Never hesitate to present and defend a policy by reasoning rather than not go that way. I end finally with a point of history. Bangabandhu has frequently pointed to the relation of its moral principles with traditional values in Bengal. Do Bangabandhu's egalitarian concerns have any noticeable historical link? The answer may well be yes, they do. We can see that, for example, in the poetry, stretching back a long time, of socially conscious poets or bards. This is particularly true of the writing of poets like Qazi Nazrul Islam, but even the earliest Bengali poetry gives indications in that direction. The earliest Bengali poets, writing in an ancient form of Bengali, often reveal their concern for equity. Let me give an example. When Bengali was evolving, one of the earliest set of writing was called Chorjapotan. The Buddhist poet, Siddhacharya Buzuku, reflected in a Chorjapotan in early 10th century Bengali about his river journey that took him from the west of Bengal through the east of Bengal. On the way east, various things happened to Siddhacharya, including being robbed of his property by pirates and his getting married to a woman of the lowest strata in the society, a woman of the Chandal caste. So Siddhacharya offered the following poem. This is 1,000 years old. I steered, this is an English translation, of course. I had steered the thunderbolts along the course of Padda, the river. The pirates have robbed me of my misery. What he's saying is that pirates have taken away my property, and he's saying that was my misery because I don't need property, but it made me just worried. He actually goes on to later verses into why he says these things. Buzuki, today, you have become, I'm continuing in the poetry, Buzuki, today you have become a true Bengali, one of the first users of the word Bengali, of Bengali, having taken a Chandal woman as your wife, unquote. So we have to understand what they say. Being a Bengali did not mean in those days any resident of anywhere in Bengal, but historically it meant particularly residents of what we call Dhaka and Faridpur now. However, that was still a big part of Bengal, and we can see how, quote unquote, true Bengalis were viewed a millennium ago. Also, as it happened, Bangabandhu was born in Tungipara in Dhaka. Since I'm from Dhaka as well, Maniganj and the city of Dhaka, Hawaii, I have to cultivate my courage before ending this talk to greet an exceptional neighbor whose great ideas and leadership have, and here I say with pride, changed the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amartya, for reminding us of all that wonderful history as well as its very contemporary resonance. Thank you so much. Let me turn to our second speaker, who's Professor Rehman Sobhan, who was closely involved in the Bengali nationalist movement in the 1960s when it was East Pakistan, was a freedom fighter in the liberation war of Bangladesh in 1971, is an economist by training, and I believe was a classmate of Amartya at Cambridge. and was a member of the first planning commission of Bangladesh and a very close associate of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. In 2008, the government of Bangladesh honored him with the Independence Day Award. And Professor Sobhan is currently chairman of the Center for Policy Dialogue in Dhaka. We look very much forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, Director Shafik. It is a great honor for me to be invited to comment and discuss Amartya's presentation and to make a few remarks of my own, honoring the memory of Bangabandhu is, of course, now a major appreciation that a long phase where he was erased from the historical memory of Bangladesh has fortunately not done any enduring damage. And in fact, in the contemporary world, under the regime of his successor, his immediate successor, Sheikh Hasina, his daughter, we have had opportunities to, in fact, remind people of his seminal role in the creation of Bangladesh. This is being appropriately commemorated in his centenary year. Unfortunately, most of this is having to be done virtually. This year was meant to be a year of great public celebration, and we've had the misfortune of not really being able to partake of this. However, the Zoom process has its advantages because it in fact has solved many logistical problems and has been able to bring people around the world who may not have been that easily able to move around. Amartya has, of course, concentrated appropriately on emphasizing the secular and cultural dimensions of Bangabandhu's involvement in the creation of Bangladesh, which were very central both to the logic of the Bangladesh state and also very central to Bangabandhu's own values. What in practice as a working politician was, I think, especially important to him was, of course, the instrumentalization of religion, which was a problem which he faced virtually throughout his political career when he began the process of a democratic struggle and the assertion of the rights of the Bengalis, because the way in which the ruling classes of Pakistan essentially chose to address the demand for a democratic and self-ruled state for Bangladeshis was to not take this on head-on as a reflection on their own malgovernance of creating an inequitable state and society, but to in fact treat it as an instrument of alien culture with which they associated Bengali, and in fact, that religious influences were in fact being abused, and this was a demonstration again of the apostasy of the Bengali people. So he fought this all his life to argue that you are in fact abusing religion and in fact using this as a political instrument for the denial of both democracy and justice to the people of Bangladesh, and actually in the wider sense to the people of Pakistan. And so this was, I think, a very central element in his belief system and was a major issue when in fact he presided over an independent Bangladesh and set about framing the constitution. Professor Raunak Jahan, who has written extensively on the secular beliefs and contribution of Bangabandhu, in fact cites instance in which when the constitution was being framed, he actually summoned both Dr. Kamal Hussain, who was the framer of the Constitution as the law minister, and Professor Anis-uz-Zaman, who in fact did the Bangla translation of the Constitution, and very specifically emphasized the importance of the way in which he chose to define his version of secularism, which was actually to emphasize that it should not be abused for political purposes. Sadly, this was used as one of the instruments to, in fact, actually create a climate of opinion where he could be murdered, where his religious beliefs could be challenged and could be wrongfully interpreted as a person who was rejecting the religion of the majority population. And this was, in fact, the political agenda of successor regimes with their power originating in the cantonment to, in fact, actually exercise undemocratic power over a period of close to 24 years. His successor today, Sheikh Hasina, has rightly emphasized that, in fact, religion is not meant to be abused as a political instrument, and that essentially you must let people go about their religious practices, but to do so with a sense of freedom and equality. And I think this is what Amartya has correctly emphasized. Where I will take on from Amartya's presentation is, of course, the wider concept of equity and democratization, because he has emphasized the democratization of faith. What I would emphasize is Bangabandhu's belief in the democratization of opportunity. Whilst secularism was one of the principles inscribed in the Constitution, we should not overlook the fact that the other important principle, which he again insisted be inscribed, was socialism, a somewhat unfashionable word nowadays, but an idea which Bangabandhu believed in very strongly. And for those who essentially have argued that this was more of a sort of rhetorical statement on his part, I would really point again to his extensive writings. Here again, we owe a debt to Professor Raunak Jahan, who has extensively researched his philosophy and his social philosophy, with repeated emphasis on the fact that he wanted to create a state in which exploitation would be in fact done away with. He emphasized that. He wanted an egalitarian society. He wanted a society in which there would be no privileged ruling elite, which was in fact the construct in which the Pakistan state really established itself, where it not only denied regional equity, which impacted on the Bengalis, but in fact, it was a highly socially inegalitarian society with high levels of inequity. And one of his driving beliefs when he was in fact instructing us in the Planning Commission, when we were setting about preparing the policy agendas for an independent Bangladesh, was the fact that we should not reproduce the constructs of the Pakistan state of an inegalitarian society with a privileged elite whose privileges were in fact actually built and perpetuated by state power and policy. And here again, he was very clear in his mind. I had the privilege of working closely with him, not just after independence, but prior to independence, and along with a number of my economist colleagues, we were in fact instrumental in preparing the election manifesto of the Awami League where had its historic win in the 1970 elections, in which in very extensive conversations with him, he made it very clear that we should make it clear that it isn't only that we want to achieve self-rule for the Bengalis through a highly autonomous process of governance, but that it should also, in fact, ensure that it would be an egalitarian society. And in fact, the dispossessed of the Bangladesh should in fact actually be major players in that society. And what again was very clear, if you have read his writings, is that these views came to him not through, you may say, sort of purely sort of ideological thinking, derived really from our readings and our understandings in the way perhaps that both Amartya and myself have perhaps acquired our beliefs in a more egalitarian society. We both come from a slightly more privileged background. The significant point about Bangabandhu was that his concept of socialism originated in his revealed experience, because he was a person who built his party from the grassroots up. And he was in fact traveling around the country on foot, on country boats, on third-class railway compartments, dealing with peasants, dealing with workers. And it was their lived experience which in fact impacted on him, and in fact was a perpetual preoccupation with his concerns. One of the first political agitations he led in an independent Bangladesh as a student of Dhaka University was to in fact address the problem of getting higher wages for the class 4 employees of the university. This was quite a remarkable thing for a student to be preoccupied with. And this was, I think, a very important element in the way in which we constructed the political agenda and the economic policies for a post-liberation Bangladesh. Big problem was that these beliefs and this commitment, which was again further reinforced by the nature of the liberation struggle, where both the fighting as well as the main burden of sacrifice and the shedding of blood was really done by the working people, you may say what we call the Shorbohara, or the proletarian classes of Bangladesh, who really bore the price. And what he repeatedly emphasized to us as policy advisors is that under no circumstances must we create an economic policy and a society in which the state would end up again patronizing an aspirant Bengali middle class, which would soon become its ruling class. We should really create a society in which the majority of the population becomes stakeholders, both players in the creation of wealth and in the benefit of that wealth. This was a very central element in his agenda. One of the reasons I would argue that in fact he ultimately was killed was not just because of the type of society constructed, but because of the fact that he set about committing himself to create a process of social transformation, which was unacceptable to significant elements of what was then perhaps an emerging elite at that period of time. So I think we should keep that in mind, because we now live in a world which has gone through its own process of transformation, where we are living in a much more market-driven world in which the emergence of elites have in fact become a major feature of contemporary society, including our own, I wish to point out. And these remain very far removed from the dreams and visions of Bangabandhu. If we were to really honor him today in his centenary year, and to in fact honor the people of Bangladesh in their 50th anniversary, one of the most effective ways we would do so is to in fact resurrect the memory of his commitment to egalitarian society where opportunities were democratized, and that we should in fact be able to put in place policy agendas which would in fact create such a society. This of course applies not just to Bangladesh, but it applies to our neighbors and to those around the world. We are familiar with the statistics which are now being put out about the impact of the COVID universe, where huge inequalities have been further accentuated. And obviously, in any meaningful tribute to Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, this should then be very central to our policy concerns, both here and around us. I thank you for this opportunity, and I express my appreciation for Amartya, who of course is a Bangladeshi by ancestral origin. So I might point out that Bangabandhu actually came from Faridpur, so he's a near neighbor and will become much closer after the construction of the bridge over the Padda. But still, he does not come quite from your part of the world, Amartya. But again, thank you. And I express my great appreciation to both the London School of Economics and to the South Asia Center for, in fact, taking this opportunity to partner with the High Commissioner of Bangladesh to, in fact, commemorate the centenary of Bangabandhu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sobhan. That was wonderful. And I just wanted to remind listeners that if you have questions, please put them on Facebook and we will feed them into the speakers. But before turning to the questions, I just wanted to invite all the panelists, including Her Excellency, if they had any reactions to each other's presentation. Amartya, did you want to add anything to what's been said?
No, I think the points that I could have gone on to, Rehman covered extremely well. And I should also mention, since Lord Nadiahan has a paper on secularism in Bangabandhu's conception. I think it's a paper of the is it the Asia Society, Rahman?
Yes, that's right. The Asiatic Society.
Yeah, and that has a lot of very important, interesting material.
Very good. Your Excellency, is there anything did you want to react to any of the presentations before I turn to the questions?
Thank you very much. But first of all, I have something to address to you that, we were talking that, to celebrate the centenary, we wanted to do this postdoctoral fellowship, Bangabandhu postdoctoral fellowship at the London School of Economics, particularly the South Asia Center, and I hope that we can work on that. So thanks, for all the support, and we'll continue to work. I have actually two comments, one addressed to Professor Sen and the other one addressed to Professor Rehman Sobhan. The first one is that Professor Sen mentioned about the asymmetric definition of, secularism as Bangabandhu promoted. As you know, I mentioned in my talk that despite being a devout Muslim, he rejected the idea of an Islamic Republic of Bangladesh. And it's extremely important. I want to ask him that in today's Bangladesh, in today's 21st century, when Bangladesh is achieving its 50th anniversary, how important it is that Bangladesh should continue with these values. And not, separation of state and religion for the continued prosperity that Bangabandhu's daughter, Prime Minister Sheikh, is currently trying to achieve for an egalitarian society or, equality and inclusion. How important it is to have this, secular and Bengali nationalism combination instead, to hold on or to sustain the prosperity for Bangladesh. And for Professor Rehman Sobhan, who mentioned about 1975, I would like to ask that, I know there's a simplistic way of putting it of why did Bangabandhu have to die? He was killed so brutally. Was it because it was a clash between his values of secularism and people who didn't believe in it? And does that threat continue in Bangladesh even today? What kind of Bangladesh would 65% young population of Bangladesh like to see? In his opinion, given that Bangabandhu had to pay with his life because he never compromised on his values of separating the state from religion. Thank you.
Bhimani, do you want to go first?
Oh, I see. Oh, right. Well, I think what I would like to emphasize is that the circumstances in which he was killed are, of course, more complex, and the nature of the conspiracy is not limited to our borders. But certainly there were elements who were driven both by repudiation of his conception of secularism and who in fact were uncomfortable with his commitment towards a more egalitarian society. These elements, of course, will always remain alive and well. And of course, whilst we may have government in a state which in fact remains committed to the secular ideal, society has not necessarily become more secular over the years. And in fact, actually, there is a tendency both here and around the world where in fact society has itself become more sectarian in its perspectives. And this is a factor which I think we all have to take into account. I think Professor Shafik herself will be familiar with that phenomenon in her own country. I think this is a factor which we should certainly keep in mind. And of course, we should further keep in mind that in the Bangladesh of today, we of course do have a much more inegalitarian society and with a much stronger and wider vested interest, which in fact has built up over the years, again, not just here, but in many other societies, in perpetuating inequalities, and which will present a much more severe challenge to the realization of a more egalitarian society. One of the great advantages that we had in post-liberation Bangladesh was that virtually the entire ruling class, including the dominant economic class, were all non-Bengalis who at the time of the liberation of Bangladesh physically exited Bangladesh, so that they abandoned vast swathes of economic assets, which were then taken over by the state. And so that in fact, the challenge of constructing policy in the face of resistance from an elite economic class was not a problem which we immediately faced in Bangladesh. But this is certainly not the case today. And this is an issue which would need to be considered to anyone aspiring to build a more egalitarian society.
I have a question now from the audience for Amartya, which is, Mujib always said that he was deeply influenced by his years in Calcutta in the 1950s. So could you say something about the Bengali intellectual traditions in Bengal, Calcutta at this time and how they might have shaped him?
In 1950?
40s.
40s.
Yeah, the question is 50s, but 40s. 40s will do.
Before 47.
And?
Before 47.
You were there, Rahman. The 1940s were a very difficult time. It wasn't clear where the divisiveness came from, and there was certainly a political movement involved, and there was this tension about how many people would want Pakistan and how many people would like to remain in India. And there were big ways it was being counted. For example, the Isfahanis, a Sheikh family, but among the establishment in Calcutta, going towards Pakistan made a major difference to the way people saw these debates. So I think what happened, and this is quite important, once and it's very important for understanding and related to the High Commissioner's question about the relevance of the need for a secular perspective along with everything else in your political thinking. There was a kind of decline of that. I was part of the time in Dhaka, and I can see that in parts of Dhaka that was happening. There were much more of that even in areas where my old school, St. Gregory's in Lukiwada was, but also generally in Dhaka, the parts of Dhaka where I stayed in, namely Wari, didn't really have that. No, the Ramna have that particularly, but Sakyapati and so on, these areas certainly had these divisions very strongly. I think the one thing that emerges in my mind clearly is that just as is possible with vision and with clear reasoning, and I keep emphasizing clear reasoning because to me, we can't understand Bangabandhu without understanding the reach of reasoning, and that it is possible to deal with these devices and violent tendencies through confronting them with power and reasoning. In this respect, both Bangabandhu and Mahatma Gandhi took a very similar position. We don't know what Tagore would have thought. He died in 41, and so that wasn't. I think he probably would have been in the same direction, but I think that was the big thing going on at that time. Now, the issue of, what happened, of course, in some ways, and I can't, not sure that I entirely agree with Rahman, but I think the suppression of the religious division was to a great extent because of the force that language-based thinking took on. So that was the divisive, but divisive in a different way between Urdu and Punjabi on one side and Bengali on the other. And so that, in a sense, drowned the Hindu-Muslim division. And that was in the context of Bangladesh, it was a big positive move. On the other hand, it wasn't as if that you just countered the religious division without unleashing the force of another very potential concern, namely the language issue, which became such a big thing. I'm not sure on the disagreement with Rehman. I agree with Rehman on many of these things, including his view of Calcutta, since unlike me, he's a Calcutta guy. I'm a Dhaka person, but he grew up in Calcutta and he has a lot of things to say on Calcutta. But I'm not sure that just judging from the writings and what emerges from Bangladesh today, that the secular forces are weaker today than before. It seems to be quite the opposite. The secular forces were being tried out. Well, it was 52, of course, was a big thing, but it began from 49, but it kind of established roots that, in a sense, it hadn't in Kolkata today. Otherwise, BJP will not be such a threat in the elections that are coming. And it's amazing for someone who grew up in Kolkata and Santiniketan to think that BJP is a serious political party that the voters might take into account as a possible leading party. Now, there's a history to it. The decline of left, the CPM, is certainly part of it. And the way the left took the fall in the hands of Trinamool and thought that somehow BJP may come in to help in getting justice against Trinamool, which is very unsound thinking. But that thinking could flourish only because of a kind of weakness that we didn't really have. I mean, if you think of the history of Kolkata, whether you talk about Nazrul or Michael Madhusudan Datta, or even those who are, Vidakar, or even those who are thought to be not quite totally secular, like Bankichand Chattopadhyay, would have found it very difficult to understand the role of BJP that's emerged in Kolkata. I find it difficult to believe. And when people say that it's possible they may win the election, that seems to be almost unthinkable. So I think there's something that's happened which has to be understood and much more clearly. We had a lot of eloquence on this subject. I was reminded the other day of a great Iranian mathematician, Al-Biruni, who spent 10 years in India and wrote a definitive, I think the best book on India ever written was written in 1010 AD, and that was by Al-Biruni. But he also wrote about the maths in India. That was his main area. But the aside comment he makes that there are many things very admirable in India, but what I admire most is the ability of the Indians to speak eloquently on subjects on which they know absolutely nothing. And so there is sometimes listening to what's going on about the politics of Bengal, I have to remember Al-Biruni had said that there is that possibility. I just don't know. But I don't agree. I mean, it seems to me that Bangladesh has a more secure foundation of secularism there than India has been able to construct, even in Bengal.
Thank you very much. I've got a question for both of you, which I think might have to be our last question because we're running out of time. Do you both think that greater inequality in the economic sense feeds into greater inequality in treatment by the state of different religions? Do you, on the back of this, think the prevalence of a more purely capitalist ideology increases the likelihood that secularism will be diluted? Maybe I'll start with you, Professor Sobhan, and then turn back to Amartya.
Well, I think one of the dangers which is emerging, and this may also be evocative of your own circumstances in Egypt, is that with the decline of the left, it's a political force, not necessarily as an ideological system, around many parts of the world, where societies are becoming much more unequal. It is really some of the fundamentalist parties which are in fact really becoming the voice of the proletariat. And so they are the ones who are really articulating the inequality of the elite and in fact identifying them as sort of acultural people who are violating the cultural norms of their society and are in fact violating the basic tenets of their faith. And in fact, the political parties have really become their instruments, and that it is only now the mosque which is now appropriating to itself the right to in fact actually speak for these forces. This I think is, I would certainly see as one of the great dangers which are emerging as a challenge to secular society. I think in Bangladesh, this is less of a problem because in fact, the corresponding political forces have been historically much weaker and have never had much of an electoral presence, in contrast to Egypt, where in fact, presumably, the main force with the highest sort of electoral representation is in fact a fundamentalist political party, and which would be the case in much of the Arab world, I suspect, if any sort of democracy were in fact to be put into practice. But in our case, I think it is a factor, and we should take that into account. And the main challenge is that if you want to build a sustainable secular society, then you also have to build a society which in fact is far more responsive to the concerns, you may say, of the majority of your population, who in fact are not integrated into a more sort of westernized, globalized world. And you have to really create a much more inclusive and participative process, not just in benefits through social protection, but in inclusive and in a much more structural sense of the term, where they are in fact getting a much more democratized access to resources, to markets, and to many of the other elements which are in fact to create a sort of permanent base for strengthening their participative role in society.
Thank you so much, Professor Rahman. Amartya, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think there is a connection between the economic inequality issue and the religious divisiveness issue, mainly because in the context of engaging people's mind, there are certain concerns that come to occupy a central position. And if one of those central positions is taken by, say, the economic inequality issue, Marxism, for example, then that is a strong antidote to that being also occupied by, say, Hindu rhetoric, and which is what's happened. I mean, if you look at what's happened in Calcutta, basically the decline of the left dialogue, left priorities, and for which the lack of organization of the left party is a lot to blame. When that happened, then there is a gap into which all this thing about Jai Sri Ram and so forth come into the story. There's very little room for Jai Sri Ram when you want the workers of the world to unite. It's not that they magically one transforms into the other. It's just that one leaves, the absence of one leaves room for the other. And if you see the absence, I mean, that's one way of understanding it. If you take the Communist Party in India, it used to have 62 seats in parliament. Then it fell to 40s, in 30s, in 20s, and now, I don't know, 3 or 4, I think. So this is vacating certain positions. And this is where Alnoor comes in, you get extraordinary theories that now that the left has declined and a non-left but secular party, Trinamool has taken the position, the way to beat it is to beat the Trinamool, and if the Hindu activists can help you there, why not? But there's lots of reasons why not, because once they help you there, you're not going to be able to dislodge them. And I think, so the unsound thinking, and this is again, since this is Bangabandhu's meeting, the clarity of thought has no substitute. Thinking very broadly about all the influences together has no substitute. Thinking about the issue of equity cannot be avoided, and if you can't say, as for a while, was their slogan that Aage round for a round. First, you do round, which has never been a particularly big object around in Bengal. And then round comes later. That's a completely confounded thinking. In fact, the lack of historical understanding is very strong there, basically. I mean, for example, Ramayana was taken as a very big story. As it happened, Ramayana as a story sent was a contribution of the Muslim kings, actually, because the translation from Sanskrit to Bengali of both Ramayana and Mahabharata were done on the initiative of Muslim kings on Bengal, as Dinesh Chandra sends History of Bengali Literature bring out. These were nice evening stories, which the Muslim kings, though Muslim, quite like listening to. But that, to convert that into some kind of holiness and some kind of story that buildings can go on grounds of Ram having been born there, it's not a Bengali story. It could be an Ayodhya story, not a Bengali story. So I think there has been a profound lapse from clear thinking, from distinguishing between history and political and scientific analysis. And so we are in a state where something is needed. And my thesis was that we do need Tagore, we do need Nazrul. There's no question about that. We do need the magazine with which Nazrul was most associated, namely Lamont, meaning the plough. And it, every week it had the quotation from Chandidas about human truth is the highest truth. There is no truth above that. That's of course a heretical thought, but that background that Calcutta in particular, as the big city, I mean, I'm a Dhaka person, but I have to say that Calcutta had a cultural position which at that time Dhaka could not match. But that is declined in a comprehensive way. And even though Sheikh Mujibur was not from Calcutta, and I gather you're not from Dhaka too. Rehman says he is from Faridpur. But I think that, I mean, he was a student in Calcutta, of course, he was in Islamia and so on. But he can represent that aspect of Calcutta, which I found when I arrived there in 1951. And the riots have just stopped. And people were settling down to life and asking the question again and again, what went wrong? We want to know what went wrong, and no one could discuss it as clearly as Bangabandhu did.
Well, thank you so much. And I wanted to just thank all of the panelists for doing such a wonderful job of bringing the spirit of Bangabandhu into this session, reminding us of his wisdom and the important intellectual legacy that we can still learn a great deal from. And I'll turn it back to Alnoor Bhimani to close the event.
Thank you very much. Let me thank Rehman Sobhan, Amartya Sen, High Commissioner Tasneem, and of course Baroness Minouche for an excellent moderation of the talk. Absolutely riveting. And thanks, of course, to all of you listening in on Facebook. We do hope you'll join us on the 8th of February for our next event. In the meantime, take care and see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Very good.
Bye.
Everyone. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Amartya and Professor Rehman Sobhan from the High Commission.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you.
Wonderful.
And thanks, Minouche. I'll see you soon.
See you soon, Amartya. Yeah? I look forward
Great book,
to
by the way.
it. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you liked it.
It is a great book, yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. It really means a lot to me.
Okay. Bye.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Take care. Joy Bangabandhu.
Roman, I'll call you.
Okay, let's talk. We haven't talked for a long time.
Yeah, will you be? Are you in Dhaka? Where are you?
I'm in Dhaka very much in my apartment since the 12th of March.
What's happening 12th of March?
I've been in my apartment since the 12th of March of 2020 for almost a year. So therefore, I'm going